If I had to describe GCF in one word, it would be caring.
Authentic.
Family. Community.
GCF in one word, family.
Fun.
Belonging.
Community.
Gracious.
Resurrection.
Family.
GCF is the best family. GCF to me is
Shall be
home.
called. So if you have a Bible or you want to look it up on the Bible app, you can find Mark chapter 4 right around verse 35. One of the things that you'll often hear is that people will talk about how Wilmore is like Mayberry. I heard a new one last night. Allie Rhodes, who's one of our GCFers here, told me last night that she had a friend in town who had never been to Wilmore Old Fashioned Christmas, and they were kind of walking around wide-eyed and said, "Oh my gosh, is this Whoville or what?" And I thought, yeah, that maybe Wilmore may be more Whoville than even Mayberry, but it was a good night last night and a good day yesterday. Cookies and crafts with Mrs. Claus, just amazing to watch everybody serving. And so I just want to say, I still smell like apple cider this morning because we had quite a debacle with apple cider last night, but downtown. But it's good to watch everybody serving and watch everybody loving the community. So thank you. I want to second Leanne in that, just saying thank you for doing that. Well, about 20 years ago, a researcher named Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great. And in the book Good to Great, he was dealing with why some major corporations experience long-term success and why other major corporations do not experience long-term success. And it really was a groundbreaking book in the world of business and leadership. It has really shaped almost everything that's been written about leadership since it came out. There's so many amazing things in it. Of the many ideas that Jim Collins talks about that he discovered in his research in that book, he said that in the companies that are effective over the long term, the senior leaders spend a fair amount of their time making sure that the right people are in the right seats on the bus. Exceptionally important thing for a leader to do. Some of you know this because you work in places where the wrong people are in the wrong seats on the bus. And so you probably know what it's like to have somebody who's promoted to a management position simply because they have seniority, but they have absolutely no skill or acumen for leading or managing people. You know how that just makes everybody frustrated, and over the long term, it really prohibits the effectiveness of the organization or of the business. Or think about this, how this works in terms of a ship. And I'm not talking like a modern-day cruise ship, but think of like an old-fashioned schooner, one of the 2, 3, 4-masted ships that used to sail the oceans. And if you're on a ship like that going across the Atlantic, you do not want the cook sitting at the navigator's desk charting the course while the navigator is down in the galley doing the cook's work, right? You don't want the bowman trimming the sails, setting them for the wind, and the person trimming the people who trim the sails up at the bow keeping lookout. It's not going to turn out well. You don't want the newest crew member who knows the least about sailing captaining the ship at the back on the wheel while the captain is swabbing the deck with bucket and water. I mean, to have the wrong people in the wrong places on a ship like that would spell disaster, and especially if it happens in a storm. Well, a handful of Jesus' disciples were pretty expert sailors. They were fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And they were once out on the Sea of Galilee with Jesus when a storm came up. Now the storm, and when the storm came up, they were actually pretty convinced that Jesus was the wrong person in the wrong place at the time. They didn't think it was a really good idea, as it turned out, to have Jesus on board their ship in the midst of a storm. Now the storm came up in the evening. Jesus had been teaching all day near the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and crowds had been coming in around him. And because the crowds were pressing in on him, he had to step off into a boat, which was tied just offshore, and teach from the boat to keep the crowds from pressing him literally into the lake. He taught pretty much all day long, told lots of parables. Some of them are recorded in Mark's gospel. Some of them he just says he told a lot more stories than this. And toward the end of the day, as the sun began to set over the Arbel cliffs to the west of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus says this: "Let's go over to the other side." And so they get in the boat and they set sail on the Sea of Galilee. Now we call it the Sea of Galilee. In Israel they don't call it the Sea of Galilee. We call it the Sea of Galilee. But the truth is the Sea of Galilee is really just a lake. That's a good sized lake. It's about 15 miles from north to south at its lengthiest point. It's about 8 miles wide from west to east at its widest point. It's about 141 feet deep at some of its deepest places. It's really just a lake. But you get these winds that come down off of the Golan Heights, and these winds that come down off of the Arbel Cliffs, and they meet in the middle on the Sea of Galilee, so that the Sea of Galilee, even though it's a lake, is often quite choppy. And there are times when these winds are fierce enough coming down off the heights and coming down off the cliffs that they create these furious little storms on the Sea of Galilee. And so while Jesus and his disciples are sailing across the Sea of Galilee, one of these furious little storms pops up as the winds are meeting each other. It says a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Guys, this was an all hands on deck moment. Right? This is like, we need more people helping trim the sails. We need another person to help with lookout. Whoever's steering the ship needs somebody else back there on the tiller with them. We need people bailing water. This is all hands on deck. And so they get into this situation, and one of the disciples says, "Hey, has anybody seen Jesus? Hey, have you guys up there, has anybody seen Jesus? Is Jesus up helping trim the sails?" And they're like, "No, James and John have got Philip and Bartholomew up there with them. They're working on trimming the sails to get across the lake. We haven't seen Jesus. Hey, is Jesus up at the stern helping keep the lookout?" Thomas says, or Andrew says back, "No, Jesus is not up here keeping lookout. I've got Thomas up here. He's got really detailed eyes, an eye for that sort of thing. He's keeping lookout. Well, is Jesus at least helping bail water?" And somebody says, "No. Philip and Bartholomew are working on that, and they've got Simon and Judas and Matthew, because really all a rabble-rouser and a bandit and a tax collector are good for is bailing water when you're at sea, and we've got them doing that." And somebody says, "Hey, Peter, back there at the tiller, is Jesus back there in the stern with you, helping you with the tiller?" And Peter says, "No, but if somebody sees Jesus, will you please tell him I could use some help? I'm getting splinters back here trying to keep this thing on track." And then Peter maybe looks off to his right or his left and says, "Oh, wait a minute. Guys, Jesus is back here, and he's asleep, cuddled up on a cushion like a baby. How can anybody sleep in the midst of this? How can anybody sleep through a storm like this?" And they get a little miffed at Jesus about this. And so they rebuke Jesus. They say, Mark tells us the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" It's like, wake up and help trim a sail. Wake up and help keep the lookout. Wake up and at least bail some water to keep this tank on the top. You've got to get up and help us. And Jesus gets up. And he does not help trim the sails. He does not go to the bow and strike a courageous pose, charting the course to the far side. He doesn't even get a bucket and bail water. Jesus stands up, and he tries talking to the storm. He tries telling the storm what to do. Now, this would have been a comical moment if they hadn't been caught in a storm. I mean, the disciples are thinking, we've really never tried that. We've never really seen anybody else try that. And there's a good reason for it. Winds and waves don't listen to human beings. And so Jesus rebukes the wind, and then he tells the water, "Quiet, be still." And the disciples are thinking this is not going to work. I mean, this is a futile effort. This is not how it works. But immediately, the winds don't just die down slowly as winds do. Immediately, the winds just die. Complete stillness in the air. The waters just don't simmer down over a bit of time like they normally do after a storm. The waters immediately become placid and still. And the storm immediately is no more at the words of Jesus. And Jesus looks at his disciples and says, "Well, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Listen, from Jesus' point of view, these guys on the boat have already seen him heal hundreds of people. I mean, dozens at a time. They've seen him heal them. They've seen him cast out demons. From Jesus' point of view, they should have been gathering up to themselves a little bit of an inkling of knowledge that Jesus had a lot of power and a lot of authority, that a storm was no big deal from him. From Jesus' point of view, the disciples at this moment should have been falling on their knees and proclaiming, "Jesus, you are just the right person in just the right place on a boat in a storm." And that is exactly not what the disciples said. Instead, Mark tells us this. They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." They didn't get it. They didn't get it. They didn't get it because Jesus, as a human being, was doing things that they had always believed only God himself could do. Only God could speak and make the natural forces obey. No human being had ever done this, and they had been taught to believe that human beings couldn't do that. Now, some of you who, attended Sunday school a lot, know your Bible pretty well, may be thinking, well, what about Moses? Remember Moses there when the people were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea, and Moses raised up his staff and the waters in the Red Sea parted? Well, every good little Jewish boy and Jewish girl had been taught that Moses may have raised his staff, but Moses didn't make the water part. They had been taught Moses raised his staff because God told him to, but it was the power of God that parted the waters of the Red Sea. The prophet Isaiah, referring back to this event hundreds of years earlier, says this to God: "Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made a road in the depths of the sea so that the redeemed might cross over?" Only God could part water. Moses could raise a staff, but only God could control the natural forces. And this is why they're so perplexed about Jesus, because here they have a human being who did something that they had always been taught only God could do. This was massively confusing to them. Massively. Here's why they're terrified. They don't know what to make of this. Well, that same prophet Isaiah, about 800 years before all of this happened, writes several times over about this new king who is going to be born. He's going to be a Messiah king, a Savior king, who will save Israel from his oppressors. It's that verse that little Odin read so well for us earlier. And Isaiah says this: "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Guys, 3 of these 4 titles were regularly used to describe kings who were good kings. Any king in the ancient world who gave really good advice, who ruled with wisdom and spoke with wisdom, could have been called Wonderful Counselor. Any king who really cared for his people and provided for his people could be called Father. And not only Father, he could have been called Everlasting Father, which would have been a way of saying, we hope that your dynasty goes on forever. We hope that your children rule forever. Any king who kept tranquility in his kingdom and ruled with justice could have been called Prince of Peace. But nowhere in the record of the Hebrew Bible or the history of the Jewish people do we ever find that a king was referred to as Mighty God. Now, when Isaiah wrote that this new king would be Mighty God, I suspect that Isaiah was just trying to indicate that this new king was going to operate some in the power of God like no other king had ever operated in the power of God. But Jesus' disciples came to a radically different conclusion than Isaiah. The conclusion that they came to was based upon the fact that they saw Jesus do all of these amazing things. Then they saw him crucified. They saw him die. Then they discovered that he was raised from the dead. And in experiencing Jesus dead and then raised from the dead, they came to the conclusion that Jesus was not just a human being who operated somehow in special power from God. They came to the conclusion that Jesus was indeed the mighty God in human flesh. That's how he spoke to the natural forces, and the natural forces obeyed him. He wasn't just a human being. He was the mighty God in human flesh. And in the first 200 or 300, 400 years after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, the earliest Christians tried 100 ways to figure out how to explain this. That Jesus was human being, but also mighty God. And one of the clearest statements that they came up with goes like this: I believe, every Christian was supposed to say this, I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages. And then get this part: God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, made of the same substance with the Father. Jesus, they came to believe, was the mighty God in human flesh. But that day, on the boat, they didn't get it. They looked at their passenger list in the storm, saw that Jesus was on the passenger list, but they had no idea that the mighty God was on board that boat with them in the storm. Guys, if you're a follower of Jesus, check your passenger list when you are in the storm. If you are a follower of Jesus, check your passenger list when you are in the storm. Because you will find that Jesus is on board. And if Jesus is on board, you have the mighty God with you in the storm. And how you respond to a storm depends entirely upon who you have in the boat with you. Entirely. So what Jesus was talking about, how you respond to a storm is always a matter of fear or faith. Remember, he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Jesus understood that the way you respond to a storm depends upon whether or not you're in fear, or whether or not you have fear or you have faith. Because one way of responding to a storm is full of worry and panicked activity. How many of you have responded to a storm in life that way? Worry and panicked activity, running frantically from one thing to the other. Have you ever seen anybody in the midst of a fit of fear in a storm who actually wanted to be in a fit of fear in the midst of that storm? No. Everybody in a storm, nobody in a storm wants to be in a fit of fear. Everybody in a storm would love to be in a fit of faith. Because faith brings composure. Faith brings thoughtfulness that helps us determine the right course of action to take. Jesus is basically saying whether or not you respond to the storm with fear and worry and a fit of panic, or you respond to the storms with composure and thoughtful activity, it depends entirely on who's in the boat with you. So who would you like to have in your boat if you're in the midst of a financial storm? I think it might be cool to have one of these two guys in the boat. It's Jeff Bezos, richest man in the world, worth $106 billion personally. Of course, you know Bill Gates, he's now, after decades, the second richest man in the world at $104 billion. I don't think he begrudges Bezos that $2 billion. I can honestly say if I was in a financial storm, I'd rather have Bill Gates. He seems to be significantly more charitable than Jeff Bezos. But yeah, if you're in a financial storm, it'd be great to have one of these. I mean, these guys could pay off my mortgage and send my kids to college and fit me up for the rest of my life with just $500,000. It'd be great to have them on board. Well, what if the storm you're facing is mental or emotional? Some kind of relational turmoil. I think it'd be cool to have one of these two people in your boat. That lady there is Brenda. I believe her last name is Miller. I can't remember for sure. She's the premier neuropsychologist in all the world right now. An expert in the neural pathways that connect your left brain to your right brain. And what goes wrong in them and how to re-engineer them. That guy, the other guy there's one of my favorite names, Martin Seligman. About 30 years ago, Martin Seligman said, hey, instead of looking at what's wrong with people's psychology, you ought to look at what's right with people. Created a whole field called positive psychology, which is what many people want to study now. It'd be great to have one of these two people if you're in an emotional storm or a mental storm or a relational storm. What if somebody's actually threatening you with violence? And what if the storm you're facing is you're literally afraid of somebody? Well, it'd be cool to have one of these two guys in your boat. It's Andy Ruiz Jr., the heavyweight champion of the world, and Conor McGregor, ultimate fighting champion, and a guy who just otherwise goes ape nuts crazy at any given moment on anybody he wants to. Wouldn't be bad to have them in your boat if somebody was threatening violence to you. Well, what if your storm involves serious illness? Wouldn't be bad to have one of these two people in your boat. A guy is Dr. Hilary Ma. He is the chief oncologist at the MD Anderson Cancer Center at the University of Texas Hospital. the #1 cancer hospital in America. The lady is Dr. Elsa Arrocho Quiñones, who's the chief pediatric neurologist at Boston Children's Hospital, the #1 children's hospital in the United States. If you were seriously ill, it'd be good to have one of the two of them in the boat with you. I mean, it would just be good to have all of these people in the boat with you to go through anything in life. Here's the thing, guys. Even if you had all of these people in your boat, you would find that in many storms they would still be inadequate to bring you the kind of composure and thoughtful action you want to take when you're in a storm. And even though none of us have these people in our boat, we all have good people in our boat. Most of us do. I love having my wife in my boat with me. I love having some of the elders here in the boat with me, the staff in the boat. There's great people. But I find that routinely, as great as they are insufficient to help me find composure and thoughtful steps forward in the midst of a storm. I've been thinking a lot about this lately because my daughter goes to college next fall. She was accepted at one of her chosen schools, and we've already been thinking about getting her ready. My son is already starting to aim for what schools he's going to apply to in the spring. He's only got a year and a half left at home before college. And already my kids as teenagers have been facing some storms that having their mom and I in their boat doesn't really solve the problem. And in life, they're going to be in some storms that whether they like it or not, or we like it or not, we simply can't be in the boat with them. And as I think about some of those storms they faced and some of those storms that they're going to face, can I just tell you, I hope to God that because they are followers of Jesus, they will check their passenger list. Because if and when they check their passenger list, they will find that Jesus is on their boat. The mighty God is with them, and He will be with them in all of the storms that their mom and I cannot be in them with. Guys, if you're a follower of Jesus, check your passenger list when you're in the storm. You have Jesus on board. You have the mighty God with you. And so if you're not a follower of Jesus, and you're thinking, I really would like to have some composure. I would really be able to thoughtfully think my way through what the next steps are. I would like not to be worried. I would like not to be panicked every time the waters of life get a little bit choppy. I would suggest that what you might do today is this. And say, Jesus, I believe you are the mighty God. I would like to have you on my boat. As a matter of fact, I'm giving the boat to you. I don't just want you on it, I want you to pilot it. I want you to captain it. And you will find as you do that, that you will begin experiencing composure and the ability to thoughtfully think your way through things because you've got the mighty God on board with you. And you'll move from worry and panicked activity to composure and thoughtful behavior. Now, for those of you who are followers of Jesus, I have two questions I want you to really think about this week. Here they are. What person or people do I expect to calm my storm? And are they capable of doing it? What person or people do I expect to calm my storm, and are they capable of doing it? For those of you who are married, this is a really important question, because one of the detriments to marriage is when the other person in the marriage thinks the other person is going to calm their storms. Be able to solve all of that. And it's not just in marriage, it influences itself in all of our relationships. So are there people? Is there a person that you expect to put you calm in your storms that simply really isn't capable of giving you the kind of calm and composure and thoughtfulness that you want? The second question is this. Is Jesus on my passenger list? And I've left out a word there. And what do I believe He can do with this storm? Is Jesus on my passenger list? And what do I believe He can do with this storm? let's take just a minute to pray.